spinning, and then okay, it is. Oh wait, an error occurred. See if this one works. Hey, there it is. There's no go live error now. Oh man, for everybody tuning in, I had like the whole spiel going, and then I found out that we weren't even live yet. Anyways, it's Friday. It's hotline time. That is not Daniel Akridge. I'm joined by the great and powerful Brad Shanna. Daniel Akridge is on a long-deserved bout of PTO. Fun fact to everyone in the audience, when he comes back, you should congratulate Daniel Akridge on not being on the hotline when he was on PTO. I actually told him, do not come on the show when you're on vacation because everybody needs a break. But for those of you who are new here, we do this every Friday. We've got a bunch of content on the YouTube channel. We got a podcast that comes out Thursdays. We got that CMMC show that comes out on Tuesdays. We do this every Friday. We take questions from events that we go to, calls that we're on. You go on CUIHotline.org. You can leave a message at the number. You can fill out the form. You can put it in YouTube chat. You can put it in LinkedIn chat. You can DM us questions from everywhere, of all different kinds, all across the spectrum. That's what we do every Friday. But Brad, tell the people at home, who the heck are you? And you're not Daniel Akridge. What's going on here?
I'm not Daniel Akridge, but I did eat at a Waffle House one time. So Daniel has taken a much needed PTO, and I'm glad that he is actually taking PTO because I know it's hard for him to step away. He's a busy guy. So I am the Director of Product Management for our managed services for our MSP and our MSSP. If you're not familiar with those terms, managed service provider and managed security service provider. We call the MSP service Guardian and the MSSP service Vigilance.
Gotcha. Sweet. And then let's see. So, I mean, I guess before we get into thoughts of the week, you were IT director at a Summit 7 customer, and then you actually came over to Summit 7. Is that what's the origin story here?
Yeah. So I owned my own consulting business for like a decade, and one of my customers was a defense industrial based customer, and they just needed some SharePoint help. So I helped them out, and the CEO called me one day and he was like, hey, could you be our IT director? And I was like, yeah, that's not a far jump from SharePoint administrator to IT director for defense industrial based
That's
company.
How it happens.
So, yeah. So I jumped right into that, and it was a very steep learning curve. Learned how to spell NIST very, very quickly. And then I started to look for managed service providers because I was the only IT guy and I wanted to be able to go on vacation. And so having a managed service provider that was
IT directors taking vacation. Let's pump the brakes here.
It's a very far stretch to get to actually go on vacation and not have to answer the phone. But if I'm on a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean, can't exactly answer my phone. And if it's hitting the fan, then somebody's got to help, right? So I came on board, quickly learned about NIST 8800171, and started looking for managed service providers to help out. And that's when I came across Summit 7. Funny story, I actually reached out to several managed service providers about helping us. Summit 7 was the only one that actually responded to my request. And I reached out to some big ones, so I was a little bit surprised. So that's when I got engaged with Scott, and I actually went down to Huntsville, met with them, talked with them, kind of feel them out a little bit and see how they did business and how they could help us. And I was all in on using Summit 7 from then on. Very trustworthy company, and I really enjoyed getting to know Scott and Amy a lot. And so from then, learning about CMMC and all that entails, I started going to all the CS2s, started listening to Jacob, and realizing how big of a mountain I had to climb. It was a very, very overwhelming situation for me of never having to do anything like that, and then all of a sudden being thrown into, I got to prepare for CMMC. This is right around the corner, and this is coming, and we need to be ready by end of next year, and all that stuff. This was back in 2019, 2020. So obviously, it didn't come that quickly. It didn't come as quickly as we expected. But so from then on, for about 3.5 years, it was preparing for CMMC and constantly trying to develop or policies and procedures and get better at it and make sure that we had everything covered. And then I started to look for another opportunity, and I reached out to Scott. I was like, hey, Scott, I'm just letting you know, I'm looking, seeing what's out there. And so it wasn't too long after that I came on board as the director of product management for managed services. So now I'm the product management for the product I was actually using.
There you go. Yeah, you liked setting everything up for CMMC so much. You're like, what if I could do this for hundreds of companies instead of just one?
Yeah, it's like one was so easy. Why not do it for hundreds, right?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, so yeah, well, it's awesome having you here. As you can tell from your story, everybody, Brad's an OG, been around, done the thing before he came over to Summit 7. That brings us to your thought of the week in review here, Brad. We were talking about this beforehand. Do IT leaders really know what it takes to do CMMC? I mean, this is from your firsthand experience.
Yeah. Maybe I'm just a dummy. Maybe I have no idea what I'm doing and I'm just, faking it till I make it. But I did not realize the level of detail that I was going to have to go into for an assessment until I really got my CCP. When I got my CCP and I really looked at, and reading the CAP too. So looking at the what was really required in order to prove that you've met an assessment objective, I was overwhelmed. I was like, holy crap. I had no idea what I was doing back then. And I thought that I knew what I was doing and I had my documentation together and all that stuff. But I did not realize how much I was going to have to show my work during an assessment. And I was a one-man band doing that. That was not gonna work. If you are a one-man band or even a two-person, IT department, I don't know how you're gonna do it. It is a ton of work. That's why I needed Summit 7 to come and help me figure out, like, how do I get this stuff configured? How do I show my work? How do I document this? Like, help me prepare. And that was a part of my journey of just learning all that. And then once I got my CCP, it was like, oh man, it's like, I thought I was ready until I got my CCP. Then it's like, okay, yeah, I don't know as much as I thought I did.
Yeah, no, it's a lot. It's a lot for sure. So, yeah, I mean, we see that all the time. There were some really great questions that got queued up that came through on Reddit and things like that. And somewhat often, pretty often, there'll be threads on there that's like, hey, I'm one person, or hey, we're two people. And it usually comes down to like, how realistic is this? So like, in your opinion, for the evergreen answer here, whenever you see those threads, what would you tell the 1 or 2 person show?
I would tell them, unless they have a very diverse and deep experience in all things IT and all the systems that they have to manage and the policies and procedures, and being able to have gone through some kind of audit before, unless you have that level of expertise, I think that you're going to need help. I just don't see that being possible.
It's a lot of work, man, especially like if somebody's got to take vacation. Imagine that somebody's got to take vacation, somebody gets sick, or somebody leaves, right? It's
or the proverbial IT bus. I mean, it happens, right? You find, they're offering you leave, and then somebody else has to come in and try to pick up the pieces behind you. There's a lot of reasons why you don't want to just be on an island by yourself.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, some of the most, I'd say, in-depth conversations that we have on calls pretty often with company leadership or with like senior IT leadership is just the fact that outsourcing is cheaper, because even if the company wanted to hire a big enough team to be able to carry the load across everybody, it's expensive to hire those people if you can find them, and it's hard to keep them if they can actually do the work. So from a business perspective, it just makes sense to outsource it.
Yeah, and it's not just the salary numbers that you're looking at too. It's all the benefits and everything.
On
top of that, I mean, it's a huge expense to build a team like that. And if you can find somebody that can do it for a fraction of the cost for you, that's a win-win to me.
Yeah, for sure. All righty. Well, let's see here. So I don't know if anybody caught the podcast this week, but I don't know if anybody has caught any of Katie Arrington's statements since she started performing the duties of the DoD CIO, but the way that I would describe this is that the DoD is super big mad. They are ultra pissed about continued non-compliance with the DFARS cyber suite of clauses, the lack of implementation of NIST SP800171, especially contrasted with people continuing to push back, or in Katie's words, complain about the CMMC program. So last week at CS2, Katie was up the road at TechNet Baltimore, and she gave a keynote, and we took clips of her keynote and went through it in this week's podcast that came out. So everybody should check that out. And I've said this once, I've said it a million times. This is not Katie's opinion, right? The only difference between when Katie is there or not is whether the DoD is saying what they're thinking out loud, right? I remember when this happened, when I first started in the space and Katie came on the scene. I mean, she threw everybody for a loop because, you know, her language, her energy, everything about it was in your face, being like, this is ridiculous, and we're cutting the crap, and we're going to actually make people do this. And I remember, like everybody else at the time, being like, this lady's crazy. Like, this lady's out of her mind. It's all Katie. And it wasn't until I learned about the Federal Register and all of the previous rationale explained and all of the previous DFARS rulemaking back to 2011 that I was like, oh, the DoD has been saying this all along. Katie's the only one that's been saying it out loud on a stage with any kind of energy behind it. And so everybody's associating it with Katie. So when Katie left, everybody thought, oh, that's over. And that wasn't true, right? Which was basically the premise for all of our content over the last 4 years was just because they're not saying it out loud doesn't mean they're not saying it. So we do podcasts on like obscure DoD policy documents and like strategy documents that no one would read. And you would see these things pop up all the time if you would just look for them. And that was unfortunately, you know, not enough of a motivating factor for most people in the DIB. But now Katie's back, and she has some very choice words for people. In that keynote, she talks about the fact that, you know, this is why there are so many False Claims Act settlements that are happening. And the DoD is really curious about why people are saying that, you know, they're implementing their requirements that they've had for almost a decade. But then when it comes down to just showing the work, as you said, and proving that you've implemented, then it's suddenly a problem. And so if you're saying you're doing the work, but proving it is a problem, that's going to make the data owner very uncomfortable, especially when they know that most people aren't actually implementing it, right? So don't take these as Katie's words. Take these as DoD policy being verbalized out loud. Highly recommend that you listen to the podcast. It's not even 15 minutes long. It's got the highlights from her keynote. We linked to the keynote in there. But yeah, for those of you, we get lots of great questions every week from people being like, what about this? What about that? CMMC dead, CMMC off the rails, this and that, this and that, this and that. Take it from the DoD directly, right? Take it from the person directly. I believe her language, the opening line in her keynote was, I wouldn't have been put into the position I was in if CMMC was not going to be a thing. And that was not a mistake, right? I believe is how she phrased it. So,
well, one of the things that she said that I thought was a very strong difference between what I heard 4 years ago when I first attended CS2 and heard her live talk about it was people are asking us like, well, who's going to pay for this? Is the DoD going to give us, you know, some money back to help us pay for these programs and blah, blah, blah. And back then it was like, well, I mean, you should be doing this anyway. You already have these in your contracts. And then this one, it was like, if you didn't plan for it, shame on you, right? Yeah. She was like, no holds bars. She wasn't holding anything back.
Yeah, that's yeah, absolutely. And it's unfortunate that it kind of takes that level of directness to resonate with people, but you can just look at this the history of what was going on. Before Katie, no one knew what was going on. During Katie 1, everybody was laser focused on what was happening. Katie left, everybody took their foot off the gas. Katie's back, people go, oh my God, CMMC is a thing. So clearly the only time that the DoD can get anybody's attention is when they get on stage and they start wagging their finger at people. You know, I'm sure that they would rather not have to do that, but it's like the only time that it works. Like, we're over here saying the exact same things that they're saying, but we're doing it in like somewhat approachable kind of, we're making memes and stuff, right? Like we're laughing and joking on a podcast, and everybody goes, oh yeah, whatever, those guys again,
those silly Summit 7 guys.
Yeah, Katie gets up there and she starts like knife handing people in the audience, and they go, whoa, I think this is really happening. And so we're like, okay. So I mean, that's how you got it. Yeah, sometimes that's what you got to do, I guess. So I'm glad that she's back, because the policy has been the same the whole time. So definitely go check out that podcast for sure. Okay, Brad, let's talk about managed security services. We're always referring to MSPs, managed service providers. I even do this when I like give the spiel of like, what is Summit 7? What do you do? And I say we're a service provider. But there is a distinction, I believe, between managed services and managed security services. Is that true? What are those things? What is the difference? How should people think about this?
Yeah, so with your managed services, you are managing IT infrastructure and systems that are assets that are already in place, and adding new ones as need be, and decommissioning. It's your typical IT type role, right? So managing workstations, managing servers, managing networks, managing services, SaaS services like Microsoft 365 and Azure and things like that. But with the managed security services, we are monitoring all of those things and watching for intrusions, and then responding and isolating those assets and your data, and making sure that we are minimizing the impact of a possible incident or an intrusion. We also will help with filing an incident report, which, as you know, you've got very little time to file an incident report. And so when an incident is identified, you need to get that report submitted as soon as possible. So it's really about monitoring all the assets that we can get logs from. That's the key, right? So if there is an asset that we're not able to get a log from and into a SIM, then there's very little that we can do to monitor and protect that asset. So we try to make sure that we are managing assets that we can get logs from. And there's a lot of different nuances and different types of assets that we could talk about. But one of the things I wanted to touch on, two things actually. So vulnerability scanning and reporting and remediation. Vulnerabilities are really, really important, as everybody knows, right? So 0-day vulnerabilities come out. You got to wait for a hot fix or some kind of way to remediate that vulnerability. We scan for vulnerabilities, and we can provide reporting on those vulnerabilities that are found. But then we can also remediate those vulnerabilities for you if you have both the Guardian and Vigilant service, because the Guardian service does the patching. And so in order to install those patches, we need that service in place where we're managing that asset for you, and not just monitoring the service. So the managed security service is Vigilance, the managed service is Guardian. That's where they work really, really well together. If you already have an IT team and you don't need the Guardian service, we do have an add-on for our Vigilance service of just remediation of vulnerabilities. That is an option that we can do. And the other thing that I want to talk about, and this is something that we added this year that I think is really cool, it's an attack surface assessment. The attack surface assessment is basically an open source recon of your organization. So we are going to go out and we are going to fill out a report of everything that we find that an attacker would use to attack you. So we can show you, hey, here's some information that we found about your organization out on the open internet through DNS or through social media or whatever, that then we can give to you and say, hey, this is where you're vulnerable, and we recommend that you do these things to be able to remediate those issues. And we can help if need be. But that's something that we added this year that I'm pretty excited about.
Yeah. It's always stuff like that where, you hear them and you're like, man, these are just sort of like basic good things to do. But it's always one of those situations where it's like most people would not do it if there wasn't some sort of external catalyst, like a contract clause, a regulation, or a verification program that would sort of push them in that direction. So that's Good to know. Well, on that theme about the one-man band and having to do the continuous monitoring and all that stuff, there was an interesting Reddit thread that people should check out. And the question basically was, should I get a managed service provider to do all of my network monitoring? And they said, in short, I'm a one-man IT shop for a company of around 70 engineers. That's a lot of users for one person. They said, we deal with CUI data, and we're in the process of moving to GCC High. My biggest manpower problem is monitoring. Implementing and actually watching all of the monitoring tools is just too much. Would I be better served to get an MSP to perform these duties instead of maybe hiring an entry-level sysadmin role to help implement and monitor the network? A lot of people in the thread were saying your entry-level sysadmin probably isn't qualified to do that kind of monitoring.
Yep.
Does this line up with sort of what you were telling us earlier about your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had about half that number of users that I was managing, and I absolutely would want to outsource any monitoring of asset services, network, whatever. Several reasons for that. Not to mention the incident reporting that's required, and the help and being able to do that, the help and being able to remediate incidences as they come up, intrusions, and 24/7. Vigilance and Guardian are both 24/7 services. So somebody is constantly monitoring your environment as a Vigilance customer and watching for intrusions and being able to remediate those intrusions. So if it is something that we are monitoring for you, then yes, we can monitor that 24/7 and watch for those intrusions. So I would absolutely say, unless you're willing to build a team that is available 24/7 and has the experience to be able to remediate those intrusions as they're detected, I would say you got to outsource it.
Yeah, I think that's probably the right call for sure. Alrighty, let's see here. Drew said, "Is VoIP, is it in scope for CMMC?" And then Evan said, "VoIP even has its own dedicated control in 800.171, the requirement 3.13.14." So, as of right now, VoIP is called out directly by NIST SP800171 Revision 2, specifically the requirement 3.13.14, which means it will be verified by the CMMC program. The CMMC program doesn't implement any of its own unique unilateral requirements. They wanted to back in the 2020 version, but that didn't end up happening. The VoIP control goes away in NIST SP800171 Revision 3. NIST says just treat this like you would treat any general protocol. So back in the day, whenever NIST SP800171 was originally written, VoIP was more of a standalone issue for people to manage. And so, yeah, it's going to be in scope for CMMC in the sense that there is a requirement to deal with it. But eventually, when we move on to 171 Revision 3, it will be less of a concern.
And I'll throw in that we actually do Teams voice management as well. Yep. That's something that the Guardian team can manage for you. So that is something that we can do. Not every managed service can do that. That's something I found is that we're a little unique in that. There are others that can do it, but it's pretty unique to have that skill set.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, so let's give the DoD a little bit of credit here. So we were at CS2 last week, and somebody asked the DoD directly, Mr. James Gillooly, who spent 2 days with us there, can the DoD put the CMMC assessment process guide, the CAP, on the CIO website? DoD CAP CIO. Sorry for all the acronyms, everybody. Can the DoD put the assessment process guide for CMMC on the CIO website? And I'm happy to report that they put it on there like with it less than 24 hours later. So, never let people tell you can't fight City Hall, right? If you got a good suggestion, it's easy to change. They put it on there. You don't have to go hunting it down. So, fun update. The CAP is now on the CIO website under CMMC resources and documentation. If you haven't read it, you really should, because it's very important.
Yep.
All righty. Let's see here. We talked about the difference between managed services and managed security services. Here's a fun one we were kind of talking about a little bit just a few minutes ago. So on the Cyber AB Town Hall, on the last one that we had, they said somebody was very emphatic in a very long comment question people often use the Q&A session for their comments. Anyways, they were very, very emphatic that NIST SP800171A and CMMC are scope creep for NIST SP800171. Couple things. The Cyber AB has no control over this. They are going to operate under the confines of DoD policy. Second of all, NIST SP800171A is the document that contains the verification procedures for the requirements in NIST SP800171. When you read NIST SP800171, the requirements are expressed in single sentences. So the question to ask yourself, or questions to ask yourself when you see those sentences, is how would I prove that I am doing this thing? And typically what would happen is, especially when they are compound sentences, you have to do more than one thing to prove that you have done this, right? This would be like saying, answer this algebra problem. And then as you go through multiple steps of showing your work, you're like, well, this isn't really math because it's just scope creep for the question. Like, you ask me the question, I give you the answer. Everything else in the middle is just sort of wasted space, and we don't actually need to do it. The thing to understand about NIST controls in NIST SP800171 or the catalog NIST SP853, from which 80171 is derived, is that fundamentally the people at NIST who are writing these cyber requirements are engineers, right? They have an engineering background. And I'm not talking like we got engineer in our title, right? We're a customer success engineer, right? We're a waste management engineer. We're a cybersecurity engineer, right? You know, talk about scope creep. Way too many people have engineer in their title, and they are not a formal engineer or have a formal engineering background. One of the core ideas behind formal engineering is requirements, right? It's not all Mythbusters out there. It's handling requirements. And a lot of times what you will have is you will have very high level expressions of system level requirements. The plane needs to go this high. It needs to go this fast. It needs to carry this much weight, blah, 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 right? So the thing that you have to do in order to engineer a solution to meet that requirement is you have to do what's called decomposing these requirements. You have to break this requirement down into a bunch of sub-requirements. And this can be incredibly complicated depending on the nature of the system that you're working on. So for instance, if you're building a satellite, right, your requirements and your requirements management and the total set of verification procedures that you'll have can be thousands or tens of thousands of things when you only had, you know, maybe a couple dozen high-level system requirements. So 171A is not scope creep. It will never be considered scope creep. You will never convince NIST that it is scope creep. You have to change your thinking around who's writing these requirements. This is why I always say that 171A and 171 should be the same document, because most people do not have a systems engineering background. They don't know what requirements decomp. Why would you know that, right? There's no reason to know that for a normal person. So even though it makes sense, I think that NIST should make it a single document in order to get around this problem. CMMC gets this right because in the assessment guides, they put the requirements and the verification procedures in the same document. But I think that they should absolutely be the same thing there. On the note about CMMC being scope creep, the DoD does not agree with you. Per policy, they do not view any of their interpretations of the requirements in 171 or how to verify them as scope creep. They view them as clarifications of their policy intent. And so they covered this extensively in the public comment responses in the 32 CFR final rule. So this comes up every once in a while. It's a little bit in the weeds, but it's not considered scope creep by NIST. It's not considered scope creep by DoD. I certainly don't consider it scope creep. You'd have a very difficult time making this case. So it's an interesting comment on the town hall, but it's ultimately a losing argument here. Yeah, Ryan said, I guess they haven't read 853A. Yeah, if you like 171A and you think that's scope creep, then you should definitely check out 853A for sure.
Yeah, prepare yourself.
Let's see here. Is there a cross-reference matrix of FedRAMP controls to CMMC 2.0 800-171 Rev 2 controls? So the closest crosswalk that you would get to would be a mapping of NIST controls of NIST 80171 requirements to NIST SP8053 controls. You can find that in the appendices in the back of NIST SP800171. They'll say this requirement is derived from this 853 control. The part that you would be missing is any of the organizationally defined values that are defined by the FedRAMP program. But I don't believe that any of the spreadsheets that have the 853 requirements on the FedRAMP website have the mapping down to 80171. So you could probably cobble those two things together if you really wanted to see what the ODPs are. But if you just want 853 to 80171, you can find that in the appendices in the back. All righty, let's see here. Take John down from here. Got rid of scope creep. All right. Does the recent DoD memo mean that phase 2 of the rollout will include C3PAO assessments? If so, what is unique about phase 2? All right, so this memo that they're talking about is available on the handy dandy CIO CMMC resources page. Let's see here. We've got the, so under external resources, under the procurement toolbox, implementing the CMMC program, that takes you over to another repository of policy documents. The most recent one from February is this memo. And we did a whole podcast on this. We talked about in the Q&A quite a bit. This is the guidance from the various Pentagon offices to the DoD workforce, the contract officers, their representatives, the program managers, so on and so forth. There is also, if you don't want to read the memo, there is also a PowerPoint on this website that talks about levels determination under this CMMC briefing right here. Basically takes all the information in this memo and puts it in a couple slides. Your mileage may vary, pick your poison. Essentially, what is happening here is that when the 48 CFR CMMC rule is final and effective, that will start what DoD calls the phased rollout. And at that point, DoD will begin inserting CMMC level requirements into defense contracts in phases over the course of about 4 years until every single contract, every single option period, all that stuff will have some form of CMMC requirement in it. When they describe the phased rollout in policy in the 32 CFR CMMC rule that went into effect at the end of 2024, they say, oh, phase 1 is going to be CMMC level 1 and CMMC level 2 self-assessment. And people stopped reading. They just turn their brains off at that point. If you read closely, what the DoD says is we have complete discretion in any of the phases to say you need an external C3PAO assessment or a level 3 DIBCAC assessment rather than just self-assessments. And we see that clarified in the memo when they basically get down to the point of saying that the phases of the phased rollout are not the determining factor in what determines the CMMC level requirement that goes into a contract. The nature of the data is what determines the level requirement. And so specifically, if I can remember where it was in the, if I can remember where it is. Yeah. So under CMMC level 2 certification, they say it's the minimum assessment requirement when the planned contract will require the contractor or subcontractors to handle CUI categorized under NARA's CUI registry defense organizational index grouping. So if you go on the NARA CUI registry, that's controlled technical information, naval nuclear propulsion information, critical safety information, DoD critical infrastructure information. I think there's one or two more items in there. Most defense contractors who are worried about DFARS 7012, 80171, CMMC, things like that, are going to be handling controlled technical information. That means, per this policy, that you need a CMMC level 2 certification assessment, not a CMMC level 2 self-assessment. So even though we will be in phase 1 of the rollout, they will absolutely require you to still get a level 2 assessment. You won't have a 12-month period from the time that the rule goes final and the phased rollout starts to get ready for your certification assessment. They're going to start putting in level 2 certification assessment requirements at the very start of the phased rollout. And we expect that phased rollout to start sometime between June and October. So if you haven't started yet and you thought, oh, we still have time before the rule is final, and then we get another year after that, you are incorrect. You've got a serious problem on your hands. So back to the question, what's unique about phase 2? Really, the only thing that's unique about the phases is when they can start to include the requirements in the option periods. So they don't say that they can require CMMC level 3 in phase 1 and phase 2. It's only in phase 3 and phase 4, if I recall correctly. But for most people, for the vast majority of companies that are doing defense contracting and you got DFARS 7012 in your contracts, you are almost certainly going to be told that you're dealing with CTI, or you could potentially be dealing with CTI, and therefore you need the CMMC level 2 certification. I would tell people to orient themselves much more closely to the memo guidance that the actual contract officers and PMs are being given, not the general outline of what DoD says the phased rollout could look like per their discretion, right? So there really isn't anything all that unique about the phased rollout. And I certainly wouldn't bank on that as being a thing that's going to insulate you from needing a C3PAO assessment at all. In fact, I was just seeing some people chatting online, and we've definitely seen this in our calls, seeing a huge uptick in the number of people who are being told by their customers, yeah, we don't know exactly when the rule is going to be published, but you're going to need level 2, so go do it, right? And we're seeing that quite a bit. I don't know if you've seen it.
It's all about the data.
Yeah, let's see here. Let's see. So Bruce had a question for you specifically. He said, hey, Brad, from your perspective as an ESP provider, an external service provider, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing other external service providers that want to get into the space? I see a lot of external provider focus on the Seek West agenda.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I would say first thing that comes to mind is resources. Finding people that can actually do the work and do it well is a challenge in the market, especially if you want people that can help with the compliance side, the GRC side of things. Those are very hard people to come by, people that have CCA, CCPs. Yes, more people are getting those certifications, but it depends on what that ESP is wanting to provide. If they're just wanting to do a CMMC L2 compliant managed services, so they're just doing the IT side of things, probably your biggest challenge is just going to be getting the infrastructure set up, understanding the requirements, and passing your own CMMC L2 and getting that certification in place. I mean, that's not a small feat. I know at Summit 7, we both on the corporate side and our managed services side, we did each of those have their own CMMC L2 certification, and it was a big effort. You got uphill, steep uphill to climb on that one. But those, I think, would probably be the biggest ones.
Yeah, for sure. I think, like one of the big challenges for most people is probably a reflection of the advice that we give to people for what they should be asking when they vet external service providers. And that's, do they have a customer responsibility matrix mapped to the criteria in 171A? So if they don't know what 171A is, red flag, right? If they know what it is, but they don't have a customer responsibility matrix that's mapped to it, immediate red flag, because you don't have 110 things that you have a responsibility for. You got 320 things as a result of that requirements decomposition process that we talked about earlier. So typically, if you've got an MSP out there that has a responsibility matrix that's mapped to the criteria 171A, it's a good sign that they know what's going on. Another good sign is, did they get their cert, right? There's a lot of companies that are working on that. Like Brad said, we have ours. They can't get through a certification assessment if they don't know what's going on with 171A criteria, right? The only real thing to look at by overcorrecting in that direction is when you have overzealous service providers that say, well, we can do everything in 800 171A, which is not true. And if you don't believe me, then you can refer back to the last Cyber AB town hall, where they took a significant portion of the town hall to explain that no, a MSP cannot cover 100% of these criteria. They can cover a lot of the stuff, but at some point there's going to be a shared responsibility for things. For instance, we as your managed service provider can't tell you which of your users are authorized or not. We don't make authorization decisions. You do, because you're in charge. We'll execute off those decisions. We can't make it for you, right? And so that's the only overcorrection that I would say you sometimes see in the ecosystem is people going, well, we'll just do everything. I mean, it's totally fine. But for the most part, that doesn't typically happen. And the best rule of thumb is, do they have that SRM? For ESPs trying to get into the space, a lot of times they don't know that 171A exists, and they map their services to 171. They operate in spaces with clients that just don't have this level of rigor in their requirements. Like a lot of companies don't have NIST requirements. They've got the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is the most abstracted form of NIST controls that you could possibly imagine. Or they got HIPAA and this and that. And they just don't have to work as hard for proving that the requirements are implemented. They do a lot of ISO and things like that. So just the shift over to a more engineering type focus of requirements verification is culturally, I'd say, the hardest challenge for a lot of those guys.
I was going to add there. So when I was IT director, we had an MSP, and CMMC, started to hit the landscape, and we talked to them about, hey, is this something you're going to pursue and you're going to try to be compliant with? Initially, they said, oh yeah, we could do that, no problem. And then as I pushed harder and they got their legal involved, they said, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. So we actually had to buy out the contract so that we could switch over to a managed service provider, Summit 7, that was going to pursue CMMC and could help us get ready.
Yeah, I think Daniel and I have talked about that on a previous show where people signed up for somewhat long-term contracts with their MSP on a verbal promise that they were going to get them through the deal. The MSP changed their mind and then leaves them high and dry at the end of the contract when it ends. And now they're all scrambling to try to get migrated, extra support, blah, blah, blah. There's lead times to get started. It's a huge mess. So, you guys can also check out mspcollective.org. Summit 7 is a member of this organization. You're going to see them all over Seek West in Vegas next week. That is a collective group of external service providers who've gotten together. They're all very familiar with the ecosystem, so you can check that out as a sort of initial list to call up and ask for more info. All righty, let's see. Scott Singer, also an OG in the space. Mr. Singer over here from Cyber9. He says, I've done 7 CMMC assessments so far, and 2 of them had a contract requirement to have a cert before they could get the order. Yeah, this is the thing that we've told people a lot, is that there's only so much that you can depend on in terms of how the policy is written in 32 CFR 170 and how it is expressed at the top level of the Pentagon, and then how it will actually play out in your individual circumstances, right? People bend the rules, they disregard the rules, this and that. Some people are going to get lucky. Some people are going to get screwed. It's just impossible to predict how it's going to play out in the diverse tapestry of the defense acquisition ecosystem. So, Scott, I don't know if you're still around, but if you are, was it the 7021 clause that they were inserting, or was this like a prime to sub, contract requirement where they said, hey, we want you to have this anyways? Like, are there any more details? I've heard of this happening. We've seen this happen. We know that it's happening. Sometimes people will get the 7021 CMMC clause and they can push back on it. Other times people just go, heads I win, tails you lose. You got to go get the cert anyways. So, Scott said it's prime to sub. So we've talked about this before. Any of the lawyers that you hear on the podcasts and the various events around the ecosystem will tell you that the DoD is expressing contract requirements, and a lot of the time, pretty much all the time, what the DoD is saying when they talk to industry, when they're putting requirements on industry, impact to industry, they are talking to the people who are on prime contracts with the department. Anything that's a subcontract between a prime and a sub, the DoD does not have privity of contract to. And so that is a private agreement. That is a private contract between those organizations. The prime has obligations to flow these requirements down whenever the relevant conditions are met, like the relevant data is involved with the subcontract. But the prime can put whatever they want to in their contract, and you can negotiate to your heart's content, because this is a contract between 2 private businesses. And so the prime can say, yeah, we don't know what the DoD is doing. We want you to prove that you're doing this right now. And they've been able to do that this entire time, which is always one of my favorite points to make to them, when they go, cybersecurity is a massive priority for us, and they go, we're not going to do anything until the DoD says what they want. And I'm like, but don't you have the ability to ask your suppliers to prove that they're doing things right now? That you don't have to wait on the department. You're sort of living on, you're sort of waiting on the DoD as an excuse. But yeah, so yeah, Scott said prime to sub, not a clause. It's a condition in the contract that they have to have the cert before they could get the order. I have heard this an increasing amount over the last 2 to 3 weeks of this is happening at a rapid pace, that this is a trend that is increasing very quickly. And that is not anything to do with the DoD. That is strictly on the primes. So that's really good information, Scott. Thanks for stopping by and letting us know. Are you going to be in Vegas, Scott? If so, maybe we talk some more about it. All righty, let's see here.
Yeah, good luck negotiating with those big primes, right? Like, go back to Lockheed Martin and be like, hey, I don't really want to.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm a 4-person defense contractor, and we're going to put our foot down and negotiate.
Yeah, good luck.
It's not going to happen. Not going to happen. So Nicholas says, our customer requires us to be compliant with NN 801, Naval Nuclear Propulsion Information, which is a more specific set of rules from NIST SP800171. Are there any CMMC auditors familiar with NN 801? I don't know off the top of my head, but I would imagine that many of them are. If you would like to, you can DM us. We'll send you a list of people that we have a lot of experience with that off the top of my head would probably be people very familiar with this, especially some of the C3PAOs out there that have been doing a ton of assessments. The Chiaris, the Fernando Machados, the A-Lines of the world. They've been doing tons and tons of assessments over the last, almost 6 months now that CMMC has been in effect. I would bet that at least one of them has come across somebody handling NMPI. And NMPI is actually a little bit more common than I think people are aware, especially in the subset of early adopters that are worried about CMMC and sort of staying and getting compliant. So yeah, reach out to us and we can send you a list of people that you can go ask. I don't know off the top of my head though. So yeah, but I'm sure there's going to be some people out there who are familiar with it. Let's see here. Let's see. Vicky said, in regards to that, I believe their NN 801 references the NIST SP 800171. Be able to walk through the NN. Yeah, maybe we'll dive into that coming up. So we haven't done an episode on NN 801 or answered very many questions about it, but naval nuclear propulsion information is one of the main things that's going to trigger assessments. So that's really, really good information. Let's see. So Wendy's here. Wendy, I think you got an episode of a podcast coming up with Daniel here pretty soon. So if you're not subscribed to the YouTube channel, like and subscribe, everybody. Producer Dustin hates it when I don't remind people to do that.
Smash that subscribe button.
Yeah. She says another trend in higher ed, probably in industry too, is an uptick in questionnaires to assessment, ExoStar, CCRA, and requests for IT contact. Yeah, I'd say that the general tone and tenor, the din of compliance conversations around this stuff is gradually increasing, and we're definitely seeing it. I mean, you can see it on the threads on Reddit, you can see it on the Discord, you can hear people talking about it on LinkedIn, we hear it in calls. It's definitely happening in terms of the winds changing to that just being a standard part, especially like Scott was saying, where they're having people in prime to sub agreements being like, go get a cert, we don't care what the DoD's timeline is, which if you're a sub, then you're definitely at the mercy of whatever they want to do.
Yeah, and I don't miss filling out those ExoStar questionnaires before CMMC, having to do the full NIST 800171 questionnaire. It's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we talked about phase 2. Let's see. Okay, comes up every week. When will NIST SP 800171 Revision 3 be required? As of right now, everything that we know is it will be required when CMMC 3.0 rulemaking is done. Right now, DFARS 7012 is under a class deviation, which says ignore the language in DFARS 7012 and use this class deviation language, and it's exactly the same, except for one small part, where instead of saying you must implement the most current version of NIST SP 800171, it says implement NIST SP 800171 Revision 2. So until they issue the final rule revising the CMMC program to verify NIST SP 800171 Rev 3, 172 Rev 3, they will leave that class deviation in place, and they'll probably issue another one that says implement NIST SP 800171 Rev 3, so on and so forth. That timeline is probably I'd say maybe we would see the proposed rule for 3.0 by the end of this year, probably most likely the first half of next year. So you're talking 12 to 24 months. I don't know, before that would be a thing that you'd have to worry about a whole lot. It's still quite a ways off. And if you have your CMMC certification assessment against Rev 2, then you even have a little bit more of a buffer because your recert doesn't come up until 3 years later. Okay, do C3PAOs assess flow down processes? No, they do not. This is actually an interesting constraint on the CMMC program. So if you caught our episode explaining DFARS 2522047012, the one contract clause to rule them all, you will notice that there are 13 paragraphs in that contract clause, and only one of them is the paragraph that says when you handle DoD's data, you must implement NIST SP800171 requirements. CMMC is a program that's verifying those requirements. It gets a little blurry whenever you start talking about some of the paragraphs that say when you put our data in the cloud, it needs to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. But if you go all the way down to the bottom of the DFARS 7012 clause, you're going to pass paragraphs C through G, which basically say we get access to your environment, you have to retain logs, so on and so forth. Those are external to the requirements in NIST SP800171. And the very last paragraph, paragraph M, says that when you flow our data down to subcontractors, you need to take the contents of this clause and you need to flow it down as well, because they have to implement the requirements when they handle our data. And it's your responsibility when you send them our data to send our requirements along with it. However, CMMC doesn't verify paragraph M, even though, in my opinion, it really should. Only a DIBCAC team will show up under the Defense Contract Management Agency to prove that you're meeting all of the paragraphs in your DFARS 7012 contract clause, among many, many others. So, yeah, as it's written today, C3PAOs do not assess flowdown, which is a big problem because there aren't enough DIBCAC auditors to go around. There aren't enough DIBCAC assessors to go around. And in my personal experience, I've seen this quite a bit where people don't know that 7012 exists. They don't know that it needs to flow down, but the data sure is flowing down through the supply chain. And so pretty quickly, once you get past the primes and maybe the tier 1 subs, you end up with this cliff where the flow down and the requirements stop. The data continues to flow, and people often further down the supply chain literally don't know what 7012 is because they've never even seen it. And that is still a problem to this day. So,
yeah, when I worked at that previous company, we had hundreds of subcontractors. We were a prime, and it was very worrying when we started to realize the flow downs and the requirements, and we're just passing on and like, hey, make sure you're doing this, and not really verifying that they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. And man, it got really messy, and it made me nervous.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's probably making the department pretty nervous too, if you're asking. So, all righty, let's see here. Under conditional status, you have under conditional status, you have 180 days to close out all POAM items. Is there a timeline for a POAM from a self-assessment? Yes, there is. It is also 180 days. Let me see here real quick. I can pull it up. You don't even have to try to dig through the big old massive 50,000 page rule because the CMMC program is in effect. And so that means that all you got to do is Google 32 CFR 170, and that will take you to the CMMC regulation directly. This is the regulation in black and white. This is the regulation free of all of the preamble of the rule. So it cuts out hundreds and hundreds of pages of public comment responses, cost analyses, things like that. Funnily enough, one of the reasons why the rules are so long is that they summarize the regulation at the top of the rule preamble. So when you read the rule, you feel like you're losing your mind because you feel like you've read the same thing multiple times. You have literally read a summary of the thing that you could have just read. It's a huge waste of time and space. But if you go down to section 170.16, CMMC level 2 self-assessment requirements, quick note, you ain't getting a self-assessment. It's not going to happen. But even if you did, it also has conditional status, which results from the fact that you wouldn't have all of the requirements implemented per the ones that are allowed to be not implemented under the guidance under the POAM section. But that you must remediate any not met requirements and perform a POAM closeout self-assessment and post those results in the SPRS system within 180 days of the status date associated with the conditional level 2 self-assessment. So just like the C3PAO assessment, which is 17017 certification assessments, come down to conditional certification assessments, plan of action, 180 days. Same thing as 17016 self-assessments has to be closed out within 180 days. If you are the lucky ducky that gets a CMMC level 2 self-assessment requirement, if you do, you won the lottery, literally. So
feels like a rug pull. It's like, hey, we have this, but you're never going to get it. So
yeah, I mean, and it makes sense because just because the assessment process is the same, regardless of who's doing the assessment. That's the advantage of having something like 171A and standardized verification procedures, is the fact that you would be asking the same questions to prove implementation that a C3PAO assessor would be asking in theory, right? That's how the process is supposed to work. The only difference is whether the DoD wants the assurance of a third party asking the questions or whether they will allow you to ask those questions. And as we know from our history of what led to the CMMC program, they're probably not going to let you grade your own homework. But if they do, congratulations. You're one of the very few lucky companies that will be allowed to do that.
Yeah, self-assessment worked out too well in the past.
Let's see here. Blah, 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 blah. Orion, we'll probably get to your question here in a little bit. If not, we'll save it for next week. Okay. When is 48 CFR expected to be final? Our estimate, based off of everything that we know about what's going on with rulemaking, is that we would see it sometime between June and October of 2025. We got a whole podcast coming out next week explaining this. We have a whole timeline that visualizes what's going on. It's like 10 minutes long. So be sure to tune in for that on Thursday. The reason why we think that it's going to be June to October is the time period from the 48 CFR proposed rule being published. The average amount of time that a DoD rule takes to go final would have it in October. However, the 32 CFR rule, which is bigger, longer, more complicated, more controversial, all these things that should have made it take longer than average, it went way faster than the average. 48 CFR rule is much smaller, much simpler. It's just a revision, way less controversial, way fewer public comments. And Katie Arrington is back. So there's a lot of reasons to believe that it would go at least faster than the 32 CFR rule. But if conservatively you just said it would go as fast as the 32 CFR rule, then that would be in June of 2025, which is like right around the corner. So we're telling people that the window for the 48 CFR rule, based off what we know now, is June to October of 2025. So pretty confident in that estimate. Almost certainly going to be this year. I would be very surprised if it weren't this year. Let's see here. Can Summit 7 monitor both my GCC high and commercial tenants?
Yeah, so this goes back to the vigilance conversation, our managed security service provider service. So yes, we can monitor both. However, they would be monitored separately. We wouldn't pull data from like commercial into GCC high or vice versa to be able to monitor those under one pane of glass. We would have the monitoring set up in your GCC or commercial tenant, and then we'd have monitoring set up in GCC high tenant and Azure Gov tenant. So yes, we can do both, but there's some caveats about just we want to make sure that data is not cross-pollinating between those environments.
That's great. Sorry, I'm laughing because Jason said I wasn't at CMMC Day because I was virtually attending CS2. Shout out Jason. But the LinkedIn crowd is reporting that David McEwen said that once 48 CFR hits, it will be mandatory for all new solicitations. Whoa, what happened to the phased rollout? I'm telling you guys, the phased rollout is just a general rule of thumb for what might happen, but it is up to DoD's discretion. It's so funny that was Dave McEwen. Dave doesn't go out in public very often. He doesn't do a lot of interviews. He doesn't give a lot of statements. But for those of you who were around in February of 2022, after we were waiting to hear what was going to happen with the transition from 1.0 to 2.0, the DoD CIO gave a series of 3 town hall events that were incredibly boring, very scripted. But when Dave McEwen went off script in the first town hall, which they did not post the recording of, somebody in the Q&A asked them, will self-assessments be allowed? And he said, no, absolutely not. We have no way of knowing if you're ever going to receive the data. It was definitely off the script. So yes, it is a true fact. The policy says self-assessments could exist. In reality, they will not exist. Now, combined with the memo and everything we were talking about earlier, it's almost certainly not going to happen. But yeah, it's always great whenever Dave is somewhere, because there's almost certainly going to be something that slips through the cracks with what the department is actually thinking. Is that the policy in black and white? No. Is that probably what's going to happen based off of what he said and the track record of things he said in the past? Yes. So I would put more weight in. It's like watching pro wrestling, right? It's like, we're all like doing this show, and every once in a while somebody slips and actually gets punched in the face. So every once in a while the DoD will slip up and actually let out what they're thinking. And I think that's probably a pretty good example of that happening. So there you go. All righty, everybody. There was a ton of questions in the chat. We got a ton of questions in the forum. We had a ton of questions that we had in the queue from previous weeks. We're behind because we were at CS2. Next week, we're at Seek West, so we're going to have even more stuff. If we didn't get to your question, we will queue it up and we'll get to it as soon as we can. If you find this recording afterwards, you can leave questions in the chat on LinkedIn or on YouTube. You go to CUIHotline.org. You can leave us a message at the phone number. You can fill out the form, especially for longer questions. The form is great. Make sure you like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We got a podcast that comes out every Thursday and every Tuesday now. We got some new shows coming up, so we're going to have content like almost every day of the week. He's Brad. I'm Jacob. Pretty sure that Daniel's going to be back from the beach next week, but if not, Brad, thanks for stopping by. Hope to see you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
See you next week, everybody.
All right. Later.